Closed captioning for Lakeland Currents is supported by the Minnesota Department of Commerce, Telecommunications Access Minnesota, and Nisswa Tax Service. Nisswa Tax Service, tax preparation for businesses and individuals. Across from City Hall in Nisswa and online at nisswatax.com.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Lakeland Currents. Nice to have you with us this evening. If you're from Minnesota or if you're from the upper Midwest and you have anything to do with the outdoors, especially if you've been a hunter or an angler, you probably have always dreamed of having a big buck or a big muskie. Well, my guest this evening has had both, and he still does get both. He's done a lot of hunting and a lot of fishing. Best known, though, for his exploitations in the world of muskie fishing. Don Pursch is my guest today. He's from Walker, Minnesota, a longtime fishing guide and an expert, not in the sense that he has a biology degree, but he's an expert in the sense that he has spent most of his life fishing these animals, and he has some fascinating stories to tell us about muskie fishing. Welcome to the show, Don.
Thanks, Ray. Nice to be here.
Maybe you could just give us a little background of who you are, what you've done, and how did you get into this business of becoming a muskie professional?
Well, it goes way back into my Longville years with my grandpa starting muskie fishing there, and proceeded on from there to the Camp Fish, which was in Walker, Minnesota. And Camp Fish was a 4-year progressive learning program, and from how fish spawn, where they spawn, to lure making, to rod building. And the 4-year progression period was the graduation. We flew them into a lodge into Canada where there was no GPS then, and map reading and boat control and fishing all species from lake trout to large and smallmouth bass.
In addition to being,
that's in a nutshell. But
a longtime muskie fishing guide, you also are a resort operator in southern Ontario. Tell us a little bit about what the resort is, where it's located.
Well, it's not far. It's 200 miles from Walker, Minnesota. It's 50 miles across the border to Nestor Falls, Ontario, where the air base is. And it's a 20-minute flight into our lodge from there. The lake is 18 miles by 7 miles. We're the only ones there. Beautiful.
And it's called Nielsen
Nielsen's Fly-In Lodge on Rowan Lake.
And this is a lake world-renowned for having trophy muskies, is it not?
It's forever. It's really been known for its lake trout fishing and who I am and where I came from, and the people that follow me. Of course, the muskies are a real big deal. They're allowed to grow up there. There's very little pressure on them, and they're just being themselves top-of-the-line predators.
And you, at one point in your life, you were a guide out of Walker, right?
On Leech Lake, yep.
And did you do multi-species fishing when you were there?
Multi-species, the walleye fishing and following the wind and catching them shallow, and then, once after about the 4th of July, the muskie season picked up pretty good, and a lot of guys fish the big lake of Leech Lake, and I never left Walker Bay. The food source there is tremendous, and high-protein food base, ciscos, whitefish, tulipies, and in my opinion, the biggest fish in that lake are in Walker Bay.
How do you see the muskies themselves? Have they changed in the time that you've been fishing? Are you seeing more fish, bigger fish, or are they pretty much what you've always observed?
Well, that's a good question, Ray. What I've seen, I was about the 40th person to buy a Muskies Inc. membership, and now they're in the thousands of memberships. And what I've seen is the legal length of a fish to be able to keep one went from 36 inches to now it's 48 up to 54 in Ontario, where I do my fishing now. It's a 54-inch minimum. And what I've seen happen through these years is these fish are just getting bigger. There's more of them because the catch and release is absolutely huge, stemming from the Muskies Inc. portion of it and the catch and release and the stocking of these fish, and a tremendous amount of effort through the Minnesota DNR of getting these fish, the Leech Lake strain specifically, and netting them and stripping them of their eggs and going into the hatchery where they're allowed to grow up under controlled conditions. And a lot of these chapters of Muskies Inc. Throughout the country are getting these muskies from the DNR in different stages of their life, like 3 inches or 6 inches or some a foot, and stocking them into some of these lakes. And you know, it's all about catching and release and educating the public. And the young people nowadays, I don't really care if it's a crappie or a sunfish or a northern pike or a 26-inch walleye. The mentality of the young people nowadays is, let's get it back in the water. Let's let this fish go, you know.
These animals are different than other animals in the lake. I mean, they really are. And if you were to compare them to the behavior of a northern pike, tell us a little of the differences that you've seen.
Well, the difference is they're cousins, of course. They look kind of the same, and you know, everybody'd like to catch a big northern pike. In my opinion, a big northern pike is 20+ pounds. That's a beautiful northern pike. Some of these people that travel to the northern provinces of Manitoba and Ontario, where these pike are they never go deep because the water remains cold a long time. The ice in some of these lakes is only out for 5 or 6 weeks. Whereas the difference in a muskie is they really like the warm water. They feel very comfortable. They've been in cold water all winter long in the winter season. And they come into that warm water, and when I'm guiding in the spring, the muskie season in Ontario, it doesn't open until the 3rd Saturday of June. It's not about the depth finder. It's all about the temperature gauge on my dash. When I find 61, 62 degree water, just sit around for a while and start looking with a good pair of sunglasses, and they're just laying there. Those big females, it's like being in a sauna for those fish. They love the warm water. Last summer, so that's kind of the difference. Do they eat the same things? A northern pike will eat dead bait. It will eat a dead fish on the bottom. It will eat a dead sucker or something on the end of a tip-up if you're winter fishing, whereas a muskie won't eat dead bait. It's got to be struggling or close to death but moving. Rarely do they pick them up off the bottom and eat them. So the real difference is the muskies like warm water. Like last summer, it was so hot throughout the provinces, throughout Minnesota, Wisconsin, all of the great muskie water. And it got to the point where it was too warm. It was in the low 80s, and on a traditional Canadian Shield lake trout lake, as we're on, that is extreme. That temperature of getting into the 84, some bays you'd go into 85, was way over the edge. They're not comfortable there. And we found them in some pretty unique places when the water temperature got up that high last summer.
So were you finding them deeper?
No, they weren't deeper. In our lake, there's about a 20-foot weed line, and you can get, and I take vertical temperatures every day that I go out fishing, from the surface to the bottom of a 20-foot weed bed. You can get an 8 or 9 or sometimes 10-degree temperature change just from the surface to the bottom. So at the bottom of the weed bed, it may be 74 degrees, 72 degrees, very comfortable for those fish. They weren't relating to the weeds. The food wasn't there. It was so warm, the food even left. And we found them out over 100 feet of water, but only 8 or 10 feet down. So the food was there, which is the number one. I mean, they got to have the food, the top of the line predator. And they were out over that very deep water. There was food there. The temperature was great. I like it here. And everybody was fishing the traditional top of the reef in the weed bed, on the weed line, on the point that extends out there a ways. They weren't on the top. They were off the sides, 8 or 10 feet down. That's where they were comfortable.
How would that affect, excuse me, how would that affect our Mille Lacs and Leech Lake? Especially Mille Lacs where there's not real deep water, probably 45 feet deep, I would guess, is kind of in that max. And I know you weren't fishing there, but what do you suspect that would do to their behavior on those lakes? And I ask that because I think they were pretty tough summers to fish, at least on Mille Lacs. I think it was pretty tough for a while.
Right. It was at Mille Lacs, tremendous fishery, walleye, smallmouth, muskie fishing in the last few years, tremendous size of the fish, of the muskies there, and when the word gets out in this small fraternity of muskie fishermen that, hey, there's a bite going on Lake Mille Lacs, It's like a magnet, and the pressure there by very good muskie anglers was night and day. Around the clock, the pressure was on those fish. A lot of those fish got plucked out of the system. They were released. And when you release a fish that is basically relating to open water where it's feeding, roaming to find food, and the water temperatures get up into the, I'm going to say, high 70s, low 80s, and you catch a fish that has just absolutely expended all of its energy, all of its 57 inches of energy to get away from this hook that's in my mouth. And then, of course, we've got to measure this fish. I need to have my picture with this big fish. It's the biggest one I've ever caught, and then put her in the water, and why aren't you swimming away? Well, it's expended all of their energy. The stress level on a fish coming out of kind of deep water, I'm saying less than 15 feet of water, to that warm surface area is tremendously stressful on those fish. I mean, they're very fragile. Even though they're the top of the line, the biggest, baddest ones around, they're very fragile. They really are.
So you think that they sort of shut down just from pressure, probably? Do you feel that that's a factor?
Well, the pressure is definitely a big factor. Now with very, very good electronics and very educated fishermen and high-end, high-technical equipment, and the innovation of the lure called the cowgirl, which is a big bladed bait, which sets off a lot of vibration in the water. They feel it on their lateral line, on their sides from a long way away, and they have to come and look. That's their nature, to be curious. The pressure on those fish, I do believe, you know, when they die, and if they die, they sink right away and eventually will float. But so I don't spend a lot of time on Mille Lacs Lake, but the pressure absolutely has. In fact, last summer when it got so warm, there was many muskie anglers that they quit fishing muskies because of the stress level and warm water on those fish that we really all love so much, you know.
Just to help them out, not to put the pressure on them.
That's right. Yeah.
When you were a guide, maybe you could just give us some tips of how you start looking for fish. What is it that you do? I know you do a lot of seminars on muskie fishing. Yeah. So for viewers out there that maybe are novices or maybe have fished and haven't had any luck, what would you tell them to be looking for?
Well, if they were to start to get a good rod and reel that'll handle a quite heavy lure, but first of all, pick a body of water that has a pretty good population. They don't have to be all big. You have to start catching them someplace, you know, and get a good lake map. And nowadays you can go on the internet and find Lake Master chips or Navionic chips that all the structure is right there on your depth finder. Doesn't cost a lot of money, and find places. You would fish muskies different in June than you would fish them in July or August. It all boils down to finding the food. If the food is there, whether they're feeding on brown or black suckers, whether they're feeding on open water fish such as whitefish, ciscos, tulipies, do your homework, do your research, read what you can read about this fish, and they have to eat, and they are never very far away from food. Whether it's in July when it's nice and warm out and the weed beds are fully mature, that's a great place to start looking for a muskie. And one of the top lures you should absolutely have in your arsenal is a surface